this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, whatever platform you may be watching on, you can type your questions or comments on that platform and they'll appear here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And I find that one of the most delightful parts of this broadcast. So today we're going to start a new discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about the Correllian Ancestors. Again, it's not the first time we've talked about them. It won't be the last. And in this case, it's been brought up by the book that I'm working on, the Correllian Book of the Dead. And of course, the Book of the Dead naturally includes the ancestors. Not necessarily the things that we're going to say today, although some of them will be there, and some of the things that are there may not be said today. That's all right. It's a starting place for the conversation. And today my intention is to focus primarily on Caroline, the founder of the tradition. But you know, we may talk about other things too. We may talk about things that connect to her. People may have questions, which may change the general direction of the conversation. Before we start, I want to remind you that this weekend will be my next Patreon workshop, and it will be on seances, how to do them. And that will be available for those people who are members of my Patreon at the seminar level. It's also available by ticket. If you're not on the Patreon, but you just want the seminar, you can get it at a price of $25 at correllianpublishing.com. So that is available. Also, on Saturday at 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern, the next Library of Horror will be shown on Pagan World Television. And it's my intention that we will also have a chat room going where we can all watch it together and share our commentary. So watch for that this coming Saturday. And hello to Mary in the chat room, Mary Cavalcante. And Mary says, I can't wait. You said that's this weekend? Yes, this Saturday. And both of them are this Saturday. So just in time for the very end of September. And so those are the next two big things that I have in front of me, at least this weekend, and we're continuing forward. Now, in talking about the ancestors, particularly in relevance to the Correllian Book of the Dead, one of the things about the ancestors, there's so many things that I could say. I mean, we could talk about their struggles, and we may. But it's really, in this context, their accomplishments that we want to look on, their spiritual accomplishments, and how those were built and what they are. The ancestors were what we like to call reincarnational scientists. They started with a certain amount of knowledge that was available at that time, but with the intention of continually expanding upon it. And we've talked about this, I've talked about this in so many places, and hello to Sir Ebony. And Sir Ebony says that they are very excited for the next installment of Library of Horror, and that it's one of their favorite things ever. I'm very glad. And this movie is Messiah of Evil. It's a very interesting movie. It's actually one of my favorite movies, particularly for the artistic style of the movie. It's also one of my great enigma movies. Why did it end up the way that it ended up, as opposed to other ways it could have been done? But getting back to reincarnational science, we often talk about how it's not enough to merely pass on what you have learned. If you can, you want to expand on it. You want to add more knowledge for that next generation. You know, no teacher can be said to be a great teacher if none of their students excel them. a teacher is not based on the things they knew that nobody else ever grasped, but rather what they helped others to learn. So when we talk about things like reincarnation, it's not passing on what, for example, Pythagoras said in 800 BC or 700, I believe it was. It was in that area. It's all the other things we've learned, all the things we learn now. When we do things like past life regressions, we learn more about this. We add that to what we ourselves have to teach, so that what we teach our students is more than we had. And that is very much an attitude that all of the Correllian ancestors shared, starting with Caroline. It may have started before her. I have no way to know. Hello to Calvin in the chat room. Good to see you, Calvin. I have always been under the impression, based on what I was told by my mother and some other members of my family, such as my cousin Gloria or my Uncle Ray, that Caroline began in a spiritual tradition. When she created the Correllian tradition, she was not creating it from nothing. She was creating it from a variety of things that were already there, and then proceeded to expand upon it. And it's been my understanding that those who came before her had that same attitude. It's not just a matter of passing things on. It's everything we learn to understand, we add. There's a saying that Correllianism is a lens through which all things may be seen. And what that means is that whatever you have learned can be part of your Correllian life. It's not like you have this knowledge over here and that knowledge over here. It's all one knowledge. It's one understanding. I understand that Caroline had magical ancestry on her native side, that she had it on her Scottish side, and that she acquired it through Aradian witchcraft as well, through what I understand was her cousin Lydia Becket, who in turn was a student of Charles Leland. And all of these things, together with spiritualism and universalism, were part of Caroline's practice. And she mixed them all together because all knowledge is knowledge. Now, Serebony says, I was just talking about this with some friends. I'm curious your thoughts on the idea that individual incarnations have their own spirit, that resources within the next lifetime installment, and could possibly explain why there's more than one person within their spirit. More than one resides in their spirit. And yes, if I understand what you're saying correctly, yes, absolutely. That's very much the Correllian teaching. That every self you have been remains within your higher self, within your soul, eternally. Just because you go on as a spirit and reincarnate doesn't mean that all the selves you have previously been cease to exist. They're still there within your soul, which also is in the higher self of that next incarnation. And also, if we remember that time is a matter of the third dimension, not necessarily the fourth or the fifth. When we say next dimension, that may not exactly be the best way to put it, but additional reincarnation. Would that explain why some feel like there's more than one person within them? Well, yes, because there is more than one person within you. All those past lives are still there. You can call them into existence if you have a way to connect to them. And you don't necessarily need to know you're doing it. They can act as spirit guides to you. And yes, in some cases, I would think that they could be a very, even a divisive force within you under the right circumstances. Certainly under some, because, I've found in doing healing over the years, one of the most important parts of spiritual life is healing. A teaching I would say goes back to Caroline. That some of them have had to do with past lives who had negative effects that had to be healed. and moved on from. Um, so yes, I would agree with that statement. Um, and both that within the soul, that higher self of that past life is still there, but within that next incarnation, it's also still there. Um, and can have a definite effect. Now, going back to Caroline and past lives and the survival of the soul in Correllian thought has, if not its origin with Caroline, certainly the earliest thing we can actually point to. Because Caroline was very heavily involved in the spiritualist church. And spiritualism, then and now, is a belief system with multiple versions. Some spiritualists do believe in reincarnation, some believe only in a single incarnation, which probably was the prominent point of view for most of them in the 19th century. But Caroline was an accomplished medium in her lifetime. She worked with spirits, she spoke for spirits. This may go back before her, I have no way to know, but it has come down in Correllianism and in the High Correll family ever since. That importance of being able to bring through messages from spirit, it's a requirement for our third degree, but possible for anyone. I certainly started learning it before I was third degree. And to some extent, you can set out to learn it, but it will teach you, because they want to talk to you if you want to talk to them, and their schedule for you to learn may be faster than your schedule to learn, and it's important to know that you can say to them, you're moving too fast, slow it down. You absolutely can do that. As I was saying with Caroline, she was very involved in mediumship and was definitely a believer in the survival of the higher consciousness of this life. To the best of my knowledge, she was a believer in reincarnation as well. But we'll be talking more about that with Mabel than with Caroline. Because to the best of my knowledge, our deeper concepts on reincarnation come from her more than from Caroline. Caroline, in a lot of ways, was a lot more hands-on than some of her successors. She was an herbalist, and this was a very important part of her life. When I was young, I remember talking with my uncle, who told me that she had taught him most or all that she knew about herbalism, which he, still being a child at that time, still being a child at the time of her death, didn't really hold on to properly. And in later years, he said he wished he had paid better attention. He wished he had held it better. But herbalism was very important to her. She would walk a mile a day up until the last few weeks of her life, much of which was to collect herbs. And she used these in medicinal ways and in magical ways, and in perfectly ordinary ways as well. She was a great believer, for example, in things like canning your own food, as most people at that time were. And her house under the hill stood above a natural spring. And people who were at the last lustration will remember, and maybe the last couple of lustrations in Danville will remember, I meant the last lustration in Danville, people who were there will remember us talking about that spring and how after her death, it had been covered over, probably to make the house more livable, because it was a cold water spring, and it created basically a large refrigerator under the house, which is where many things that were to be preserved through the winter were kept. But at the last illustration, we found that that source of water was pushing its way back to the top. Not in quite the same place, but undoubtedly the same underground source of water, which was very remarkable because in all those years that had not happened. Um, but she worked with herbs for your everyday normal uses of herbs in cooking and so forth. She worked with herbs also in magical ways, and some of the things that I was told that she specifically did. One of them was apparently she would sell herbal preparations in velvet bags for magical uses. The one that I was particularly told about was aphrodisia in a red velvet bag um, for attracting love. But apparently there were many others also. And um, and then she also had a sideline of making horseradish and selling it um, at farmers markets and on the side of the road, which is another aspect of that herbal knowledge. Very little of which came down to me. Um, as I say, much went to my uncle, but he didn't hold on to it. And hello to Tom in the chat room. The mediumship, on the other hand, came down very strongly. She was also a healer through energetic healing, particularly the laying on of hands. And my mother, when she was still alive, would tell the story of how she had been born with an unattractive birthmark on her thigh. And as she was starting to grow up, she talked to her grandmother, Caroline, about this. And Caroline performed a ceremony under the full moon, which involved laying her hands on this birthmark. And it changed its shape. It became a heart-shaped birthmark. Didn't go away, but became a heart-shaped birthmark that my mother carried for the rest of her life. But that's an example of healing by laying on of hands and a kind of energetic healing. Not the same as the kind of pranic healing I learned, not the same as Reiki healing that I later learned, but still energetic healing. And one with a very old history behind it. She did that as well. And all of these different things were part of what she did. You know, I talk about mediumship, which is where you bring through messages. And this was a big thing in spiritualism, as it still is, because spiritualism did not go away. It's still there. It's just much smaller than it was in her lifetime. And maybe not even that. Maybe it just keeps a lower profile. But there are spiritualist churches all over the place, still doing what they do. And the biggest thing they do is bringing through messages from these spirits, something that was part of my life from a very early point, and something that Caroline did during her life. One of the things that makes this important when we talk about the Correllian Book of the Dead, the fact that each of the major ancestors that we commonly speak of were mediums, also speaks to why they could be such effective spirit guides. When my time to cross over comes, whenever that may be, I fully expect to be a very active spirit guide, and I expect it will be relatively quick because I've spent so much of my time working in that world. I've spent as much of my time among the spirits as among the living when I look back on my life. And I've frequently remarked since my most recent health incident that I have 1 foot in the land of the spirits and 1 in the land of the living. And, I very much think this is the case. It deepens my relationship to this in ways that are important. But this practice, as I say, goes at least back to Caroline, and many of the people she was involved in also had a strong investment in spiritualism. including Lydia Beckett, who I mentioned, although her primary church was the Universalist Church, and Caroline had a connection there through her. If you're not familiar with the Universalist Church, it's just what it sounds like. It was a universal look at religion. It later unified with Unitarians as Universal Unitarians, but it was not originally the same movement. And if you look at Correllianism, we arguably are pagan universalists. And that aspect of universalism goes all the way back to Caroline and to Lydia. It has come down all these years, and we're not about to change that point of view. It speaks to a lot of things that you'll hear me talk about in this program, even when we're not talking about Correllianism. One of them, very important, I often talk about how when I try to address a subject, I try to address it not just from my own background, but from others if I can, particularly when I was doing the daily vlog. And I would be asked about teachings about, spirits, afterlife, etc. But I would often point out, now, this is my background. Others believe different things, and I might go into what they believed so that people would have all these different things to compare to. That's universalism. That comes from that universal tenet at the very basis of Correllianism and the very basis of the ancestors of Correllianism. I think it has given us a much broader view than most traditions. I think that it gives them a very broad view as spirit guides and ancestors. And like I said, that goes at least back to Caroline. From Caroline also comes the connection, again, to many different spiritual paths, to those that were in her personal background and those she acquired through experience, such as spiritualism and Aradianism. The creation story in Aradianism has become absolutely fundamental to Correllian understandings of spirit. That came in through Lydia Beckett to Caroline. My understanding has always been that Caroline's connection to Aradianism comes from about the year 1903, from what I was told while my mother was still living. In the case of Lydia Beckett, her connection came around 1897. And one of the things that happened with her is that she happened to obtain a copy of Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches, before it was published, through a personal meeting with Leland. And according to her descendants, that copy still exists, but I never saw it. But I wouldn't necessarily have. But Caroline, because of her connection to Lydia, also picked up this connection. And the relationship between spirit and matter outlined in that story, maybe it connected to how she already saw it. Maybe it gave it to her in a whole new form. I don't know. Whatever the answer to that is probably lost in time. But from that moment forward, it really has defined our understanding of the nature of reality, how incarnation works, how these seven planes of existence work. And even the ultimate ideas of goddess and god, or if you prefer, of yin and yang, or Apiron and Piron, or whatever terms you want to use for it. How the universe is composed and how those powers interact. And that goes, again, all the way back to Caroline, relatively early in her life. The rest of the Vangelo delle Streghe, it had very little impact that I can tell. But that part, came down very strongly. And it is a matter that really informs our understanding on all things. Now, another thing that impacted our understanding on all things, particularly, again, universalism. Caroline came from a background that mixed a number of different ethnicities, including Native and European. My understanding, based on what I was told by my mother, is that from that Native background, the sun was viewed as female and the moon as male. And from the European background, of course, it's exactly the opposite. The moon is viewed as female and the sun as male. And the Caroline was raised with both these ideas, either from childhood or from very early, depending on when exactly she was exposed to deeper teachings. But what do you see? What do you gain when you look at that juxtaposition of seemingly opposite ideas? Well, what you see is that there's more than one way of interpreting the same thing. And that is absolutely fundamental to everything in Correllian thought. Yes, the sun can be both female and male, because ultimately it's the sun. How we interpret it, maybe as a goddess or a god. But that's our interpretation. That's how we see it for our purposes. What it ultimately is a star. And can such a thing really be male or female? It has no genitals. It has, yeah, I guess it depends on how you look at those terms, whether it can really be defined that way or not, except for our understanding. Now, in that different way of looking at it, part of the difference was in the different role of women in those two societies. So the role of women in the Native background that Caroline came from was far more active, far more positive than that of European women. But that is a whole other conversation, and we're nearing the end of our half hour. But to look at this single beginning and realize it is possible to see the same thing in different ways. If you look at our Correllian teachings, that is an absolute fundamental thing. Now, when we go back to the idea of reincarnational sciences, to the best of my knowledge, the main thing that comes down from Caroline is the belief in the continuation of the ancestors. I personally think she believed in reincarnation as well, but I know she believed in the continuation of the ancestors as a spiritualist. The fact that she had that concept of looking at the same thing in different ways suggests to me that the idea of reincarnation and the ancestors could easily have coexisted for her as it does for us, and that she is the beginning of that understanding. But I can't point to exactly where that would be. But it's my belief that that is the case. Now, I see that we have come to the end of our half hour. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about Mabel, the second head of the tradition, and what she added to these understandings about reincarnational sciences and in general. I had thought I might include a little bit of autobiographical information. We have not had any time for that. It's a good thing I didn't try to. But we've talked about that in so many other places. This is spiritual, and an examination of the spiritual contributions of these different ancestors. So I hope that you'll join me tomorrow as we continue this conversation. I hope you have a lovely day today, and let us end as we always do with our prayer. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. We thank you for the easy things. We thank you for the difficult things. We thank you for the miraculous things. We thank you for opening doors just when we think they're closed. And we also thank you for cleansing and healing when it comes to our lives. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we know you're always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I love all of you. I love spending this time with you, and I'll see you again tomorrow.